The city of Esperance in Western Australia has some of Australia's most beautiful beaches, but it is also notorious for sometimes serious and even fatal shark attacks. Just off the coast of Esperance, experienced recreational scuba diver 57-year-old Gary entered the water with his wife of 14 years. On the 4th of January 2020 at 1 o'clock in the afternoon at a place called Devil's Rock, Gary with his wife planned on having a fun day underwater together. Gary was wearing his full-bodied wetsuit with his dive computer on his left wrist to keep track of the depth, location, and water temperature. He also had an underwater flashlight on his right wrist for better viewing of the underwater wildlife that resided within the nooks and crannies within the rocks that could be found on the bottom. Lastly, he had a knife strapped to his leg, used not so much as a weapon in diving, but as a tool in getting out of entanglements of heavy-duty fishing line, if such a thing should ever occur, and/or if he found something on the bottom worth keeping that might still be attached to a rope or line that demanded using a knife. Gary was also wearing a buoyancy compensator device, a full tank of air for the dive, blue-colored swim fins, and a shark shield. A shark shield is an electronic device that creates an electromagnetic field to deter shark attacks and are used by surfers, scuba divers, snorkelers, spearfishers, ocean kayak fishers, and swimmers. It is considered one of the few electrical devices on the market that has performed well based on independent trials to determine the device's effectiveness at deterring sharks from attacking. Whilst it is worth noting that the shark shield technology has been found to not work in all situations. Gary's wife described to others in conversation of Gary as being a very cautious diver, and it was his habit always to attach to their boat a rope that was attached to a rock on the seabed as a secondary anchor in case the wind picked up on the surface, potentially taking their boat away from them. Gary would turn off his shark shield when he reached the bottom to tie off this secondary rope anchor because the rope had on a previous dive tangled on his shark shield device, giving him an electric shock. With the secondary rope anchor secured, Gary would immediately afterwards turn the shark shield back on again, doing all this on every dive. When the couple reached the bottom, which was at a depth of about 50 feet, Gary ended up disappearing over a mound. Why he and his wife ended up separated with Gary disappearing over a mound soon after they reached the bottom is not known. Based on that, information was not found to be available when reviewing this case. Gary eventually, not long afterwards, reappeared just above this underwater mound, and his wife could see him from both his thighs upwards to his head. At that moment when she saw Gary reappear, she sensed something was not right, and she immediately swam towards her husband. But when she arrived at the mound, in her description, the water became full of blood and sand. Then she immediately saw a large shark tail flapping in an up and down motion. She swam forward in an attempt to strike the tail with her underwater camera that she was holding and was unsure if she made contact with the shark's tail. Waiting for normal visibility to return, she could not see the shark or Gary anywhere, so she decided to swim towards the surface and ended up unexpectedly bumping into Gary. She found that Gary was no longer wearing his dive mask and his eyes were wide open, and his air tank was missing and he was unresponsive. Looking him over further, she could see that Gary had suffered a traumatic injury to his right arm. Swimming while holding on to Gary back to their boat, she tried to get him aboard the boat, but did not have strength enough to do so. While still attempting to get Gary onto the boat, she could clearly see at this point that her husband was no longer alive, and her attempts to get him on board the boat would be futile. She made what had to be the most painful decision of her life and released her grip on her husband. Gary immediately sank beneath the surface of the water, never to be seen again. With Gary's wife making it ashore with the boat and immediately notifying the authorities, an emergency search began soon after, but only a small piece of Gary's wetsuit was found floating on the surface. Search divers did later recover Gary's wetsuit vest, buoyancy compensator device, and air tank. The items listed that were found showed clear signs of a very large shark taking bites onto these items. It clearly had to be that Gary was the unfortunate victim of a great white shark attack. In a statement shortly after Gary's death, his wife described Gary as a kind, gentle, and strong man. "He and I were at home in and on the ocean," she would go on to say. "Most weekends we would go out diving in our boat whenever we could have the free time together. We were always aware of the risk and often told each other that if we were ever attacked by a shark, that we would just be unlucky." In a social media post dated 2 years and 2 months earlier to Gary's fatal shark attack by a great white, dated November 2017, Gary stated that he wore the shark shield protection device because it gave him peace of mind, like a car seat belt. Gary goes on to say, "In my 9 years of diving in the waters off Esperance, most weekends, weather permitting, I have only seen one shark, a bronze whaler, who displayed absolutely no interest in me." Following the fatal attack on Gary, the West Australian government installed 3 shark warning towers at popular beaches around the area of Esperance. Hopefully, these newly installed shark warning towers will be a big aid for those wishing to enter into the waters around Esperance.